The Mafia boss overheard his mother mocking the poor black waitress. His reaction shocked everyone. The chandeliers inside Romano House glowed with warm golden light, reflecting off polished marble floors and casting long gleaming streaks across the dining hall. At that very moment, a young waitress named Liana slipped quietly between the tables, carrying a silver tray with both hands. Her shoulders curled inward the way a person curls to protect something fragile inside themselves. She had been on her feet since sunrise, and every step felt heavier than the last. Even so, she moved with care, trying not to draw attention. Liana knew this crowd. Wealthy guests dressed in tailored suits and glittering jewelry. Friends of the Romano family. People who measured others not by kindness, but by class, by money, by height of status. And sitting at the head of the long dining table was the woman they all admired, the matriarch of the Romano family, a woman known for her elegance and sharp tongue. What Liana did not know was that the Mafia boss himself, Dante Romano, was standing on the landing above, hidden by the curve of the staircase, having returned earlier than planned. He had not announced his arrival. He wanted to watch tonight's gathering quietly, to observe the people who claimed loyalty to his family. That was when he saw his mother raise her chin and look directly at Liana. Her voice carried through the hall with that calm, cultured tone she used whenever she wanted her insults to cut deeper. Tell me, was there truly no one better to serve tonight than this girl? She looks like she wandered in from the street. Perhaps she has never stepped inside a real dining hall before. A few guests stifled laughs. One man covered his mouth, pretending to cough, but his shoulders shook. One woman leaned closer as if smelling Liana, then whispered that certain people should not be hired for events of this level. Liana froze mid-step. Her hands trembled. The glasses on her tray rattled softly. She bowed her head in a quiet attempt to make herself smaller, to disappear entirely. She whispered an apology even though she had done nothing wrong. From above, Dante Romano felt something shift inside him. He had heard every word, and for the first time in a very long time, the air around him seemed to. Still completely. His expression changed, not with anger, but with a colder, deeper resolve. No one knew he was watching. No one knew he had heard the cruelty in his own mother's voice. And no one in that room was prepared for what he was about to do next. In the same moment the dining hall fell silent around Liana, although the guests pretended nothing had happened. Their eyes flicked toward her only to judge, never to help. Liana kept her head lowered, her breathing shallow and uneven, trying to steady the tremble running through her hands. The silver tray pressed against her palms felt heavier with every second. Her heart thudded painfully, not because she feared losing her job, but because this humiliation was all too familiar. She had known this kind of silence before, the kind where people watched her struggle and quietly decided she was not worth defending. She stepped back toward the side wall, whispering another apology under her breath even though she did not owe anyone one. Hidden above on the staircase landing, Dante Romano watched her closely. The faint golden glow from the chandelier caught the side of her face, and in that fleeting moment he saw more than embarrassment. He saw exhaustion. He saw worry. He saw someone holding herself together with the last bit of strength she had left. That expression was one he recognized, not from the world of wealth around him, but from the streets where he had grown up before power had changed the course of his life. The dining hall hummed with muted conversation again, as if the insult had been a trivial joke. Yet the moment had buried itself deep inside Liana. She returned to her service station near the wall, adjusting the apron tied around her waist. She lifted another tray of dishes, her shoulders straining under the weight. Her fingers were stiff from working double shifts for several weeks, and the skin along her knuckles carried small cracks from constant washing. She told herself she needed to stay steady. She needed tonight's shift. She needed the overtime pay. Liana had been hired by the Romano House catering team only 2 months ago after her mother's health crisis had drained the last of their savings. The local clinic had treated her mother for a severe respiratory illness, but the medication had been costly. Liana had picked up every shift available, refusing to let her mother see how difficult it had been to keep the bills paid. When her mother asked whether she was doing all right, Liana always smiled softly and said yes, even when the truth was far from it. Her world had become long hours, aching feet, and carrying trays through rooms where she never truly belonged. She worked because she had to, not because she had a choice. Every paycheck brought her closer to keeping her mother in treatment, and that was enough reason to endure the sharp tongues of wealthy patrons. Tonight, however, the words had cut deeper than usual. She swallowed hard and reminded herself that she could not afford to react. Any show of frustration would cost her the shift, and losing one night of income meant choosing between groceries and medicine. As she steadied the tray in her hands, she thought briefly of her mother at home, wrapped in a soft blanket in the small apartment they shared. Her mother had always said, "Kindness is not weakness, no matter how the world tries to tell you otherwise." Liana held on to that sentence the way a person holds onto a lifeline. She stepped back into the flow of service, moving toward a table of guests requesting refills. She kept her eyes lowered, her movements controlled. Yet even as she tried to fade into the background, she felt the weight of the insult pressing against her chest. The memory of the laughter stung. She wondered why people who had so much could be so careless with the dignity of someone who had so little. Above her, unseen and unheard, Dante did not look away. His jaw tightened slightly as he watched her work through her humiliation without a single complaint. Something about the way she endured without bitterness or anger troubled him deeply. He had witnessed cruelty in his world many times before, but this moment struck differently. It was not an enemy insulting someone. It was his own family. And it was a woman who had done nothing wrong except show up to work and do her best. Liana moved carefully across the polished floor, the glow from the chandeliers reflecting off the tray she carried. Each step felt like walking through heavy air, but she refused to falter. She whispered again to herself, "You need this job. You cannot lose it. Just breathe." She did not know that the man she worked for had been watching her the entire time. She did not know that everything was about to change because of what he had seen in her quiet strength. And she did not know that Dante Romano had already made a silent decision that would unravel the rest of the night in ways no one in that room could have predicted. As the soft music in the Romano dining hall deepened into a calm rhythm, the kind chosen to make wealthy guests feel comfortable inside a world built from privilege. Every detail in the room spoke of old money and long-standing power. The marble columns rose toward the ceiling with gentle curves, carrying years of family history in every polished inch. The heavy velvet drapes along the windows softened the glow from the chandeliers, and the scent of roasted herbs and warm bread drifted through the air. It was a place designed to remind outsiders that they did not belong, and Liana felt that truth more sharply with every step she took. She balanced another tray of glasses against her shoulder, returning to the central table where the most influential guests sat. These people had ties to the Romano family that stretched back for decades. Some were political allies. Others were business partners. A few had grown up beside Dante Romano himself. All of them understood the unspoken rules of the evening. The matriarch ruled the table. Her opinions set the tone. Her judgments shaped the energy of every conversation. Even now, after insulting Liana, she sat poised at the head of the table as if the entire room belonged to her. The guests stayed attentive to her slightest gesture, nodding at her comments, laughing softly at her dry remarks. When she lifted her wine glass, one guest hurried to mirror her. When she praised the floral arrangement, others followed her lead. She was the embodiment of old-world authority wrapped in pearls and gentle smiles that never reached her eyes. Liana sensed the tension in the air as she approached the table again. The polished floor made every footstep ring gently, amplifying her presence in a room where she wanted to be invisible. She placed the glasses with care, her fingers steady even though her body felt anything but calm. She kept her gaze lowered, trying to avoid any eye contact that might invite another insult. The matriarch watched her with narrowed eyes, as if waiting for a mistake. The guests did not bother to hide their judgment, letting their gazes sweep over Liana with the kind of quiet scrutiny that could cut deeper than words. One woman murmured something under her breath, and the gentleman beside her chuckled. Liana did not need to hear the words to know they were not kind. She simply focused on breathing. Above them, Dante Romano remained on the landing, leaning slightly against the dark railing without drawing attention. From his vantage point he saw everything. The posture of his mother, the careful amusement of her friends, the downturned gaze of Liana as she stepped back from the table. He knew the rhythm of this room very well. He had grown up inside it. He had listened to the same guests praise his mother for her impeccable standards. He had watched them treat staff members as if they were replaceable pieces of furniture. He had learned, early and painfully, that respect in these circles was extended upward, never downward. What he saw now stirred something old and familiar inside him, something he thought he had buried years ago. The quiet disdain in the voices, the subtle arrogance in the glances, the expectation that anyone with less power should simply endure whatever came their way. Liana returned to the side station near the wall and set down the tray, stretching her fingers discreetly. Her knuckles were still stiff from the cold dishwater she had used earlier, but she pushed through the discomfort. She checked the placement of every glass, every utensil, every napkin, making sure she left no room for criticism. She had learned in her short time working these events that perfection was the only shield she had. If she did her job flawlessly, she could withstand the looks, the comments, the assumptions. She whispered to herself that she could get through the night. She had gotten through worse. She could survive this room filled with people who would never understand the weight she carried. In another corner of the hall, guests began to comment on the decorations, admiring the fresh flowers flown in earlier that morning, praising the designer who had arranged them. They spoke of vacation homes and business investments, their voices smooth and effortless. Their world was distant from Liana's reality, where every dollar mattered and every hour of work counted. She listened without meaning to, absorbing details of a lifestyle she would never enter. The difference between her life and theirs felt like a solid wall she could not climb. Yet through it all, she continued moving with quiet strength. She served every table with patience. She offered refills with a gentle voice. She smiled even when it hurt. And above her, Dante saw the truth. He noticed the details his guests ignored. The tired curve of her shoulders, the practiced calm in her hands, the way she swallowed her pride to keep her livelihood. He saw a woman doing her best in a world determined to crush her spirit. And in the glow of the chandeliers, surrounded by murmurs of wealth and whispered judgment, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. The balance of power in this room was about to shift, because the injustice he had witnessed tonight was something he refused to let stand any longer. The guests continued their conversations, unaware that the man who controlled the entire house was no longer simply observing. He was deciding. As a new wave of guests entered the dining hall, their laughter blending with the music while the glow from the chandeliers shimmered across polished surfaces. The room grew livelier, yet for Liana the air felt heavier, as if each new arrival added another silent weight to her shoulders. She steadied herself behind the service station, adjusting the sleeves of her uniform before picking up a tray of fresh appetizers. The tray was warm against her palms, radiating gentle heat from the small dishes arranged in perfect rows. She lifted it carefully, reminding herself to breathe steadily, to keep moving, to stay quiet. But the matriarch of the Romano family had not finished with her. Liana approached the long central table again, placing the first plate down with gentle precision. She moved to the next setting, then the next. Everything was smooth, measured, cautious. That was when she heard the sharp intake of breath from one of the guests. A woman seated near the head of the table leaned closer to the matriarch and spoke in a whisper loud enough for half the hall to hear. I cannot understand why they let just anyone serve at events of this importance. Surely, presentation matters. The matriarch lifted her gaze, her eyes narrowing with the kind of cold amusement that signaled trouble. She tapped her manicured fingers on the tablecloth, then spoke in a calm, cutting tone. Presentation absolutely matters, which is why seeing someone like her in this room is such a shock. Liana froze mid-step. The room felt suddenly smaller. The tray in her hands seemed to tilt. The quiet gasps from nearby guests did not help. Some looked away in discomfort, while others leaned closer, eager to hear more. And the matriarch continued, her voice smooth as silk and twice as sharp. Look at her posture. Look at her hands. They are not hands that belong in a place like this. They are worn. They are rough. Hard work leaves marks, and she wears them plainly. A man across the table added with a low chuckle, perhaps she should be working in the kitchen instead. That is where people with that kind of background usually belong. Liana felt her heartbeat thunder in her ears. She fought to steady the tray, gripping the edges tightly as heat rushed to her face. She forced herself not to react, not to drop anything, not to run. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "I apologize. Is there anything I can fix for you?" The matriarch lifted her crystal glass, inspecting its clarity. "Fix," she repeated the word as though tasting it. "Yes. You can learn to carry yourself properly. Tonight is too important to look disorganized. Perhaps the catering manager should take notes on whom they hire. It is embarrassing for this household." A few guests nodded in agreement. Others murmured, their eyes lingering on Liana, not with kindness, but with the subtle cruelty of people who believe they were above her. From the staircase landing, Dante watched the scene unfold. His fingers curled around the railing, the muscles in his jaw tightening with every word that left his mother's lips. He saw the way Liana's shoulders sank slightly, how her eyes flickered downward as though trying to protect the last sliver of dignity she had left. But the matriarch pressed further, leaning back in her chair as if delivering a lesson. People should know their place. Some of us were raised for rooms like this. Others simply were not. And she gestured delicately toward Liana. The insult hit harder than all the others. Liana swallowed the rising sting in her throat. She had endured many things in her life, but public humiliation from a woman who had never known hardship felt like a strike to her very core. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked rapidly to keep the tears from falling. She needed this job. She needed this income. She could not defend herself. Not here. Not in front of these people. She placed the final plate on the table with careful precision, bowing her head once more. "I will do better, ma'am." Her voice was barely audible. The matriarch smirked. "See that you do." Liana stepped back, retreating toward the wall with slow, controlled movements, though her chest ached with every breath. She whispered to herself the same sentence she had relied on countless nights. "Stay quiet. Get through it. You need this." She did not see Dante descend the first step of the staircase. She did not hear the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere at the sight of him approaching. But every guest who glanced upward caught the change in his expression, and their voices softened. None of them knew that the moment of reckoning had begun. As Liana stepped back from the central table, her hands trembling despite her efforts to steady them, the sting of the matriarch's words echoed inside her mind with a clarity that made her chest feel tight. People should know their place. Some were raised for rooms like this. Others simply were not. The sentence replayed inside her again and again, each repetition sharper than the last. She inhaled slowly, trying to quiet the ache that threatened to rise in her throat. She kept her gaze fixed on the polished floor as she moved toward the service station, hoping no one noticed the faint shimmer in her eyes. She whispered inwardly, "Stay quiet. Do not lose this. You cannot afford to lose this." Her fingers brushed the edge of the counter, grounding herself for a brief second. That was the place she could hide for moments at a time, a small corner where she could reset her breathing. She set the empty tray down with gentle care, her palms tingling from how tightly she had gripped it. The soft clatter of cutlery from distant tables blended with the low murmur of conversations. But for her, the only sound that truly existed was her own uneven heartbeat. She looked toward the hallway where servers hurried back and forth, hoping no one would pause long enough to ask if she was all right. She did not want kindness. She did not want pity. She simply needed space to hold herself together. The weight of the room pressed down on her. She knew these events demanded perfect service, flawless posture, unwavering silence. She had prepared herself for that. What she had not prepared for was the feeling of being stripped of dignity in front of an entire room of strangers who believed they were above her. She could still hear faint laughter from the table. It brushed against her skin like a cold draft. Her breath hitched, but she exhaled slowly, remembering what her mother had always told her. You cannot control what people say. You can only control who you become after hearing it. Liana lifted a hand and wiped the corner of her eye, careful not to smudge her uniform. She straightened her shoulders and forced her hands to still, reminding herself that she had survived far worse days. She had survived the weeks when her mother had been too weak to leave her bed. She had survived nights when she worked 2 shifts back to back, trudging home through cold rain only to wake up and do it again. She had survived the fear of overdue bills piling on the kitchen table, each envelope a reminder that she could not let herself break. This moment, as painful as it was, would not defeat her. She whispered again inwardly, "You need this job. Keep your head down. You can get through tonight." She took another steadying breath and picked up a fresh set of glasses. The cool weight of the glassware helped anchor her. She adjusted her posture, and stepped back into the dining hall. The lights from the chandeliers painted soft reflections across each glass, and for a moment, she focused only on the clarity of the surfaces, the smooth motion of placing them on a small serving tray. When she returned to the tables, she kept her movements slow and deliberate. She placed a fresh glass in front of each guest, avoiding their eyes, focusing only on the task. But she could feel the lingering attention from some, the subtle glances that said they expected her to falter, the barely hidden amusement from those who wanted to see her break. She refused to give them that. She repeated softly to herself, "Keep going. Just get through tonight." Behind her, the matriarch spoke again, though this time her voice was quieter. Still, the tone held the same cold edge. Some people are simply not suited for refinement. It is obvious when they do not belong. Liana felt a sharp pulse inside her chest, a mix of shame and something dangerously close to anger. But she swallowed it. She could not react. She could not respond. She could not defend herself. Her life outside these walls depended on her silence. She reminded herself again, "You have to keep this job. Remember why you are here. Remember who you are fighting for." She carried the tray back toward the service station, her head low and her expression calm even though her heart felt tender and raw. She did not see Dante stepping off the final stair. She did not see the subtle shift in his stance, the quiet resolve settling into his expression. And she did not know that every second she kept her silence, every second she endured with grace, only deepened the storm building inside him. Because while she whispered to herself that she must stay quiet, Dante Romano was whispering something very different inside his own mind. This ends now. As the dining hall continued to glow beneath the chandeliers, yet an unspoken tension settled across the room like a quiet winter draft. Guests carried on their conversations, unaware that the balance of power inside the Romano household was shifting with every step Dante Romano took away from the staircase. His polished shoes made almost no sound against the marble, but the energy in the room changed the moment he entered the main floor. People closest to him straightened instinctively, sensing his presence without understanding the reason for his arrival. The matriarch did not notice him at first. She was focused on her companions, recounting a story from a past event, her voice smooth with practiced elegance. Liana, meanwhile, was near the side station, preparing a tray of water glasses for another round of service. Her hands had finally steadied, but her chest still carried a dull ache from the humiliation she had endured. She whispered to herself, "You can finish this shift. You can get through this night." As she lifted the tray, she took one slow breath to steady her posture. She did not see Dante approaching, but the guests seated near the central table did. Conversations softened into murmurs. Utensils paused in midair. Eyes widened just slightly as Dante walked with measured steps, his expression unreadable, the kind of unreadable that meant a storm lived beneath the surface. He stopped behind the chair next to his mother, though she still had not looked up. Instead, it was one of the guests who noticed him first. The man stuttered mid-sentence and lowered his glass. "Dante Romano." The matriarch finally glanced upward, her poised expression faltering for the briefest second before she smiled. "Darling, I was not expecting you until later." Dante did not return the smile. His voice was calm, but there was something carefully restrained inside it. "I know. I arrived early." His mother lifted her chin gracefully, gesturing toward the guests. "We were just enjoying the evening. The event is going wonderfully." Dante's gaze drifted past her to Liana, who stood frozen mid-step with the tray of water glasses still in her hands. For a moment the noise of the hall faded, and all he saw was the exhaustion in her eyes and the quiet strength she had shown despite the cruelty aimed at her. He had watched every second. He had listened to every word. He looked back to his mother, and the room felt colder. "Did you speak to her earlier?" His mother blinked, surprised by the directness of the question. "Speak to whom?" Dear Dante shifted slightly, his gaze returning briefly to Liana before settling firmly on his mother. "The server you insulted." The matriarch's smile stiffened, and uncomfortable murmurs rippled around the table. "Darling, surely you are not taking this so seriously. It was a harmless observation. Someone like her is simply not accustomed to events of this level. It is best for everyone if standards are upheld." It was meant as guidance, really. Dante's jaw tightened, the only outward sign of the fury he held back. "Guidance." He repeated the word slowly, as if testing its weight. That is what you call it. He stood straighter, the gold light from the chandeliers catching the edge of his expression, revealing a quiet resolve that silenced the nearest conversations. The matriarch lifted her glass, attempting to resume control of the situation. Darling, do not make a scene. This is hardly important. Liana's breath caught. She understood now. Dante had heard everything. She felt her stomach tighten with panic. The last thing she wanted was for conflict to arise because of her. But Dante no longer cared about the comfort of the guests or the fragile pride of the people who had mocked her. He stepped closer to the table, his voice lowering into a tone that held everyone still. I heard what you said. Every word. The matriarch's hand paused midway to her glass. Guests exchanged nervous glances. The atmosphere thickened. Dante continued, his voice steady and chillingly controlled. You humiliated someone who has done nothing wrong. Someone who is working honestly. Someone who deserves respect, not ridicule. His mother's eyebrows drew together in irritation. Dante, she is a server. She is a human being, Dante replied, his voice quiet but cutting through the hall like a blade made of ice. And that is more important than whatever status you think you are protecting. The matriarch opened her mouth to respond, but Dante lifted a hand gently, stopping her words before they could form. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The entire hall felt the shift. Liana stood motionless, her breath shallow as she watched the scene unfold, unable to comprehend that someone like him would defend someone like her. She did not yet know that he was only beginning. Because for Dante Romano, this was not a scene. This was a warning, and it was only the first one. As the dining hall slipped into a strained silence, the kind that settles when polite conversations have nowhere left to hide. The guests, still seated at the long central table, exchanged uneasy glances, uncertain whether they should continue pretending everything was normal or brace themselves for something far more serious. But all their attention shifted when the matriarch pushed her chair back and rose to her feet. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and filled with a simmering indignation that radiated from her posture. She looked directly at her son with a mixture of disbelief and wounded pride. Dante, this is highly inappropriate. You are undermining me in front of our guests. Her voice was still controlled, but a fine thread of anger pulsed beneath every word. Dante did not look away. His expression remained calm, but the calmness was the kind that signaled danger, the kind that preceded storms. I am correcting a wrong, he said quietly. Nothing more. The matriarch clasped her hands in front of her, as though attempting to gather her authority around her once again. She gestured toward Liana with a dismissive tilt of her chin. That girl is being dramatic. She is clearly untrained for events of this level, and if she cannot handle simple feedback, then perhaps she should find different work. A low murmur rippled across the table. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded subtly, eager to stay on the matriarch's side. Liana felt the room blur slightly, her pulse racing as shame burned through her. She clutched the tray tightly, wishing she could disappear into the polished floor beneath her. She whispered inwardly, stay calm. Stay still. Do not react. But the matriarch was not finished. She turned her gaze directly toward Liana, her eyes sharp as glass. And you, she said with cold precision, you should be grateful anyone gave you a chance at all. If you cannot meet the standard, then perhaps this environment is not meant for someone of your background. Liana's breath caught. Her grip faltered. A soft clinking sound echoed through the hall as one water glass on her tray tipped and rolled, hitting the floor with a ringing crash that shattered the quiet. Gasps broke out. Every head turned in her direction. Liana stared down at the broken glass, her lips parted in horror. Her hands trembled uncontrollably now. She could not speak. She could not breathe. It felt as though every fear she had been swallowing all night had collided at once, breaking through the fragile barrier she had tried so desperately to hold. Her voice whispered inside her mind, no, not this, not in front of them. This moment was the breaking point. She had held herself together through every insult, every cruel comment, every stifled laugh. She had told herself to endure because she needed the income, because she had responsibilities waiting at home, because losing control meant losing everything. But humiliation layered upon humiliation had pushed her past her limit. Tears began to gather at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked rapidly, refusing to let them fall. She bent down to clean the broken glass, her movements unsteady. "I am so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am so sorry." The matriarch sighed dramatically and shook her head. "You see," she said to the guests, proving her point. "This is exactly the lack of refinement I was referring to. Some people simply do not belong in certain rooms." Liana felt a soft crack inside her chest, a crack that felt dangerously close to breaking her spirit entirely. The room dimmed around the edges of her vision as she knelt to gather the shards, her fingers brushing trembling across the cold floor. She felt exposed, fragile, small. And worst of all, she felt alone. But she was not alone. Dante watched her with an expression no one in the room had ever seen on his face before. Quiet fury, and something else. Something far more dangerous than anger. Resolve. Liana reached for a final shard of glass, her hand shaking so badly that she nearly cut herself. That was when Dante stepped forward. The sound of his footsteps echoed across the hall like a warning. He crossed the distance between them with a steady, controlled stride that drew every eye in the room. The matriarch straightened defensively. "Dante, what do you think you are doing?" But he did not answer her. His focus was entirely on Liana. She looked up at him through blurred vision, her hands still trembling above the broken glass. In that moment, she no longer saw the powerful man she had been told to fear. She saw someone who had witnessed her struggle, someone who refused to look away, and someone who, through his very presence, made every guest understand one thing. Her humiliation had reached its limit. Any further cruelty would no longer go unanswered. As Dante reached Liana's side, the quiet weight of the moment settling across the dining hall like a thick blanket. Every guest fell silent, their eyes locked on the powerful man standing over the trembling young woman who knelt on the polished marble floor. Liana's hands hesitated above the last shard of broken glass, unsure whether she should continue cleaning or move away. Her breath trembled inside her chest. She whispered softly, "I am sorry, sir. I did not mean to disrupt anything." Dante lowered his gaze to meet hers, and for a moment the world around them dimmed, leaving only the two of them in a fragile circle of light cast by the chandelier above. His voice was quiet, steady, and filled with a strength that countered her trembling. "Stand up, Liana. You do not belong on the floor." The use of her name stunned her. She blinked up at him, confused, unsure how he knew it. Her lips parted to protest, but Dante extended a hand, not forcing, simply offering. She hesitated, her fingers hovering, then gently placed her hand in his. He lifted her with care, guiding her to her feet, as though she were something breakable that he refused to let shatter any further. Once she stood, he took the tray from her trembling hands and set it aside. Then he crouched down himself. Gasps spread across the hall as the Mafia boss, the man known for power, authority, and an unshakable presence, gathered the broken glass with his own hands. The matriarch's voice broke through the shock. "Dante Romano, what on earth do you think you are doing?" Dante rose slowly, the shards of glass collected neatly in his hand. His expression was carved from calm stone. "I am fixing the mess this room allowed." He walked to a nearby waste bin and deposited the glass carefully, then turned to face the entire hall. His mother's face remained pale with disbelief as she stepped forward. "This is humiliating. You are embarrassing our family in front of important people." Dante's eyes locked onto hers. "No, you did that when you humiliated someone who did nothing but work hard." His voice remained low, but it carried across every inch of the room, echoing against the marble walls. Then, with the same cool calm, he issued an order meant for every guest. Not another word will be spoken to her in that manner. The guests stiffened. No one dared respond. The matriarch's lips trembled with indignation. "You are overreacting. She is staff. She is a person," he corrected sharply. "And you will not speak to her again tonight." The room froze. No one had ever heard Dante speak to his mother that way. The matriarch, stunned and furious, opened her mouth to protest again, but Dante had already shifted his attention. He turned and stepped closer to Liana. His tone softened, though the steel beneath it remained. "You are not leaving this room feeling ashamed. You have done nothing wrong." Liana shook her head slightly. Her voice trembled. "Sir, please. I do not want trouble. I just need to finish my shift." "You will finish nothing until you breathe," he said quietly. His gaze held hers, steady and grounding. "You have endured more than anyone should ever have to." She swallowed hard, her throat tight. But I cannot lose this job. My mother. He did not interrupt her. He listened, and that alone nearly broke her. No one else had listened to her all night. Dante placed a hand gently behind her elbow, guiding her a step farther from the center of the room so she could gather herself without dozens of eyes watching. His voice lowered, meant only for her. You are safe. No one will touch your dignity again. Behind them, the matriarch straightened her posture, her pride wounded, her status shaken. She hissed sharply, Dante, enough of this nonsense. You are forgetting who you are speaking to. Dante looked at her with a calmness that chilled the entire room. No, mother. I am remembering exactly who I am speaking to. And I am remembering that power means nothing if it is used to step on the people who least deserve it. A hush rippled around the table, spreading slowly like a quiet wave. The guests lowered their gazes. No one dared align themselves against him. Dante turned back to Liana once more. You are done working for tonight. She stiffened in panic, mistaking his words. Sir, please. I need this job. He shook his head firmly. You are not losing your job. You are stepping away from the people who tried to break you. His expression softened with something almost protective. This ends now. And with those 3 words, the entire energy of the room shifted, as if the weight of every insult had been lifted off her shoulders and placed firmly into his hands instead. As a wave of stunned silence rippled outward from the center of the dining hall, settling over every guest like a heavy winter blanket. Dante's final words, delivered with a calm force that no one dared challenge, hung in the air with unmistakable weight. This ends now. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the soft music drifting from the corner musicians felt quieter, as though the entire room understood that something irreversible had just taken place. The matriarch stood rigidly at the head of the table, her face pale beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. The confidence she once wore, like a crown, had cracked, revealing something brittle beneath it. She looked from Dante to the guests, searching for support, for someone bold enough to stand beside her, to reassure her that her authority still mattered. But no one met her eyes. The guests lowered their gazes, pretending to examine their plates or straighten their silverware. Not one of them dared align themselves against Dante. His authority carried a gravity that silenced even the worst of them. Dante's gaze shifted toward the table of influential guests who had laughed earlier at Liana's expense. He took a single step forward, a motion so slight yet so deliberate that several guests flinched visibly. The man who had mocked Liana's background earlier pressed himself deeper into his chair, his face flushing with embarrassment. A woman whose whisper had carried the cruelest remarks found her hand trembling as she reached for her glass, only to realize she could not raise it without revealing her fear. Dante addressed them without raising his voice. His tone was measured, cold, and perfectly controlled. I am disappointed, he said. His words struck the room like a blunt hammer. Not enraged, not furious, disappointed. And somehow, that landed even heavier. Several guests exchanged helpless glances. A few murmured apologies under their breath, though none dared speak loudly enough for him to hear. He continued, his gaze sweeping the room with slow, cutting precision. You all sat here and watched someone be humiliated. Not one of you intervened. Not one of you spoke. You laughed. You encouraged it. You contributed to it. He paused, the silence stretching long enough to make the guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are when no one is watching. The dining hall felt frozen in time. All the glamour, the polished marble, the expensive decor, the carefully crafted atmosphere meant to display refinement and sophistication suddenly seemed hollow under the weight of his words. One man cleared his throat, attempting to salvage dignity. Dante, please, perhaps we misread the situation. We never intended to be cruel. Dante turned his head slowly toward him, his expression unreadable. You intended to impress each other, he replied. And cruelty is often the easiest way for the weak to look powerful. The man lowered his eyes again. Dante shifted his focus to the matriarch, who stood stiff and shaken. She opened her mouth, but the words refused to come. Her carefully constructed stature as the elegant leader of these circles had slipped through her fingers, exposed now for what it had been held together by. Applause, conformity, and unchallenged arrogance. She whispered, barely audible, Dante, you are humiliating me. No. He stepped closer, his voice now soft, but devastating. I am holding you accountable. Something no one else has dared to do for a very long time. Their eyes locked. For a moment, the entire room witnessed the truth. Dante was not defending Liana simply because of what had been done to her tonight. He was defending her because she represented every person who had ever endured cruelty in silence, while those with power looked away. He turned from his mother and faced the entire room once more. If any of you speak to her again with disrespect, you will not be invited back into this house. Ever. A collective gasp spread through the hall. His mother swallowed hard, her lips trembling. Dante, you would excommunicate friends of this family over a server. His response was immediate. Yes. That single word echoed through the cavernous room with so much force that even the chandeliers seemed to vibrate. He allowed his gaze to rest one final time on the guests who had laughed earlier. Their faces were pale now, their confidence extinguished. Whatever pride they had arrived with had withered under the weight of the consequences Dante had laid out. Liana watched the transformation silently, her heart pounding in disbelief. She had never seen someone defend her with such unwavering strength. She had never imagined anyone would stand against a room full of powerful people on her behalf. She had never imagined someone would speak the truth so boldly in a place built on appearances. The matriarch sank slowly back into her chair, her pride wounded, her influence shattered in a way that no whisper or rumor could ever repair. And for the first time all evening, the room was not laughing at Liana. It was silent because of her, because someone had finally answered cruelty with justice. As the last echoes of Dante's warning settled over the dining hall, leaving the atmosphere heavy and breathless, no one dared move. No one dared speak. It felt as if the entire room had collectively forgotten how to breathe. Liana stood near the edge of the room, her back close to the service station, her hands clasped instinctively in front of her as though she were trying to hold herself together. Her heart beat so loudly she feared everyone could hear it. Her chest felt tight, not from fear anymore, but from a new and unfamiliar sensation taking root inside her. Someone had stood up for her. Not quietly, not privately, but publicly, fiercely, and without hesitation. She had never experienced anything like it in her life. She did not know where to look. She did not know what to feel. Dante exhaled slowly, grounding himself before turning toward her. The room seemed to bend around his movements. Even the warm glow of the chandeliers appeared to soften as he walked in her direction. His steps were measured and unhurried, but they carried a certainty that made the guests straighten nervously in their seats. When he reached her, he stopped at a respectful distance, giving her space while still standing close enough that she could feel the calm strength radiating from him. His voice, when he spoke, was gentle, a striking contrast to the power he had displayed moments earlier. "Liana, are you all right?" She blinked up at him, her pulse fluttering unevenly. She opened her mouth, but her voice caught in her throat. She had been asked this question before by well-meaning people, but this time it felt different. It felt as if the question mattered. She tried again, her voice trembling so softly she barely recognized it. "I am fine, sir. I promise. I am just sorry for causing trouble." Dante shook his head lightly, as if refusing to let her carry any of the blame. "You did not cause trouble. You endured it, and you should not have had to." She lowered her gaze, overwhelmed. Her fingers twisted together nervously. "I did not want anyone to feel uncomfortable. I did not want to make a scene." "You did not," he replied. "The scene was made before you ever spoke." His voice softened even more. "And it was made by people who should have known better." She looked up at him again, her eyes glistening. She whispered, "But I work here. I am supposed to stay quiet. I am supposed to take whatever comes my way." Dante's expression shifted, the faintest trace of sadness appearing in his eyes, as though he recognized a truth she had lived with for far too long. "You are supposed to be treated with respect," he said. "Nothing less." He glanced briefly at the guests who were now pretending to be deeply interested in their plates, unwilling to draw his attention again. When he looked back at her, his voice carried warmth without losing its quiet authority. "You did everything right tonight. You showed grace when you were shown cruelty. You kept your dignity when others tried to take it from you." His words landed gently yet powerfully, sinking into a part of her that had been hurting for hours, perhaps even years. Liana swallowed, her throat tight with emotion. She whispered, "Why are you being so kind to me?" His expression softened until the hardness he usually wore seemed to melt away. leaving behind a sincerity she had never expected from a man of his status. Because I saw everything. And because no one should feel alone in a room full of people. Her breath trembled. She tried to hold herself steady, but her voice shook despite her efforts. Thank you, sir. For everything. He studied her face for a moment, as if making sure she truly felt safe again. The golden chandelier light reflected softly in her eyes, revealing how close she had come to breaking. Then he said quietly, if there is anything you need, anything at all, you tell me. She shook her head gently. I only need to finish my shift, sir. And to keep my job. You are not losing your job, he assured her in an instant. His tone carried absolute certainty, enough to calm the fear still hiding behind her ribs. Nothing that happened tonight will ever threaten your place here. Not while I am in this house. Behind them, the guests watched, each one stunned by the unusual tenderness in the boss's voice. They had never seen him speak this way to anyone. And in that delicate moment, with the room holding its breath around them, Dante added one more sentence, his voice soft enough for only her to hear. You deserve better than what you were given tonight. Liana's eyes widened slightly, the weight of his sincerity hitting her with unexpected force. And for the first time since she had entered the Romano house that evening, she felt a small, fragile sense of safety settle inside her chest, like the quiet beginning of something she had never allowed herself to hope for. As the tension in the dining hall eased only slightly, leaving behind a fragile quiet that felt almost unreal after the storm that had just passed, Liana stood near Dante, her breath still uneven, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she tried to steady the swirl of emotions inside her chest. The room around her had shifted. It no longer felt like a place designed to judge her. It felt different now, as though someone had placed a protective circle around her that no insult could cross. But even with Dante standing beside her, a lingering disbelief flickered across her face. She could not understand why someone like him had spoken so fiercely on her behalf, why he had lifted her from the floor with such care, why he had silenced an entire hall of powerful people for her sake. She swallowed hard and looked down at her hands, suddenly unsure of what to do with them. The truth was simple. She did not know how to exist in a moment where she was not being belittled. Dante watched her closely, noticing the faint tremble still tracing her fingers. His voice softened again, a tone he rarely used for anyone. Liana, look at me. She hesitated before lifting her gaze, meeting his eyes only because he asked her to. The room around them blurred into the background. All she saw was the quiet concern in his expression. You did nothing wrong tonight, he said. Do you understand that? Liana drew a small breath, barely a whisper. I am trying to, sir. But it is difficult. People like me do not usually. She stopped herself, unsure if she should finish the sentence. Dante stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm, urging her to speak. People like you do not usually. What she lowered her gaze again, her voice trembling in a way that revealed a truth she had spent years hiding. People like me do not get defended. We just survive the night and hope no one notices how hard we try. His expression changed. A quiet ache formed in his eyes, as though her words revealed something he had always known but never heard spoken so honestly. He spoke slowly, each word carrying the weight of something deeply personal. I grew up in places where people were judged before they ever opened their mouths. I know what it feels like to be looked down on. She blinked, taken aback. But you are Dante Romano. People respect you. People fear you. They do now, he replied quietly. But respect built on power is not the same as respect earned from humanity. I have lived long enough to know the difference. Liana felt her throat tighten, her heart pounding in a rhythm she could no longer steady. She did not know why hearing that from him mattered so much. Maybe because no one else in the room spoke like that. Maybe because no one else saw her. She whispered softly, You do not need to say these things to me. I am just a server. His gaze sharpened, not with anger, but with disbelief at how easily she dismissed her own worth. Do not ever say that again. You are not just anything. You are a person who works hard, who carries herself with dignity, who stayed calm in a room filled with cruelty. That is strength, Liana. Real strength. Her breath trembled, her eyes watering again despite her attempts to hold everything inside. She lifted a hand to her cheek, brushing away a tear before it could fall. I just did not want to cause trouble, she whispered. I did not want anyone to think I was ungrateful. Dante shook his head slightly. Gratitude has nothing to do with enduring abuse. No one should expect you to be grateful for being mistreated. His voice lowered, steady and warm. You held yourself with more grace than anyone else in this hall tonight, including my own family. Liana's chest tightened, her breath unsteady. She had never heard someone speak of her with such sincerity, such quiet admiration. She whispered, her voice fragile. Why do you care so much? He paused. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken truth. Finally, he answered with a softness that felt almost like a confession. Because someone needed to care. And because I could not watch dignity be taken from someone who never deserved to lose it. Her lips parted, her breath catching in her throat. Dante's expression held steady as he added, you mattered long before I stepped into this room. I only wish I had arrived sooner. And with those words, something inside Liana shifted. Not healed completely, not resolved, but softened. For the first time all night, she allowed herself to breathe without fear, letting the warmth of his sincerity settle gently into the part of her heart that had been hurting since she walked into the Romano house. And though she did not say it aloud, her eyes revealed the truth. She no longer felt alone. As the dining hall slowly settled into a stillness so deep that even the soft flicker of candlelight seemed to pause in the air. The night had unraveled in a way no guest could have predicted, and now, as if the entire room were taking a collective breath, the weight of what had happened lingered quietly above every polished surface. Liana stood beside Dante, her posture steadier than before, the trembling in her hands finally easing. She felt different, not fully healed, not suddenly fearless, but restored in a way that mattered. Something inside her, something she thought had been bruised beyond repair, had been gently pieced back together by the unexpected kindness of a man she barely knew. The matriarch remained seated at the long central table, her expression unreadable beneath the chandelier's golden glow. She looked down at her clasped hands, the same hands that had once commanded rooms like this with a single gesture. But tonight, her authority had fractured, and the quiet around her felt like a reflection she was not prepared to face. Dante let the silence linger a moment longer before he spoke, his voice low enough to keep the moment intimate, yet strong enough for the entire hall to hear. Tonight reminded everyone here of something they should never have forgotten. His gaze drifted across the faces of guests who could not meet his eyes. Respect is not measured by status. It is measured by character. His words echoed gently, settling into the air with undeniable truth. Several guests lowered their heads in shame. Others swallowed hard, finally understanding the weight of their earlier laughter. The matriarch closed her eyes briefly, the realization settling deeply into her chest. She had not only embarrassed someone undeserving of cruelty, she had embarrassed her own son by forgetting the values she had once taught him as a child. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she stood. The room watched her with uneasy anticipation, unsure what would come next. Her voice, when it emerged, was quieter than before. Liana. The single word drifted gently through the hall. Liana turned, surprised by the softness she heard. The matriarch stepped forward with care, her hands unclasping as she approached. Her chin trembled slightly when she spoke again. I owe you an apology. Gasps fluttered around the room. Even Dante's expression shifted with a faint, surprised stillness. The matriarch inhaled, steadying her voice. I spoke to you in a way that was beneath the standards I expect from others and from myself. I let my pride speak instead of my humanity. And for that, I am truly sorry. Liana froze. She had never imagined she would hear those words from a woman who seemed incapable of humility. She searched the matriarch's face, looking for mockery, for insincerity, for anything that might hint at deception. But there was none. Only truth. Only a quiet, humbled honesty. Liana bowed her head gently, her voice soft as she replied. Thank you, ma'am. The matriarch nodded once, her eyes misting just enough for Liana to see. Then she turned, returning to her seat with a dignity that had been reshaped, softened, cleansed by accountability. Dante exhaled slowly, a breath of relief that eased the tension in his shoulders. He looked at Liana with a warmth untouched by the earlier storm. Tonight changed things, he said quietly. She met his eyes, her voice trembling with a truth she was finally brave enough to speak. You changed things tonight. He shook his head. No. You showed a room full of people what dignity looks like. I just made sure they did not look away. For a moment they stood there, the space between them filled with something gentle, unspoken, and deeply human. Then Dante stepped back, giving her room, offering her the right to choose the next breath, the next step, the next piece of herself she wanted to reclaim. As Liana looked around the hall, she no longer saw a room that had tried to break her. She saw a room that had been forced to witness her strength. A room that would never forget what it had seen. The night ended not with music or applause, but with a quiet understanding settling into every heart present. A reminder that power is empty without compassion. And as the last of the evening's tension faded, the truth of the night remained, suspended in the golden light, a truth that would outlive the moment itself. And that night, the world remembered what dignity looks like.